where we got it right, wrong, and where we're downright confused following the release of the Buccaneers' initial 53-man roster. That and more on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
You are Locked On Buccaneers, your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, and welcome to this episode of the Locked On Bucs podcast, your daily podcast covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much for making Locked On Bucs first listen or view of the day every day. And don't forget that you can subscribe for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. And you can follow me, your host, David Harrison, on Twitter at DHarrison82, credential member of the media covering your Tampa Bay Buccaneers for BucsGameDay.com, part of Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation. Here with you every Monday through Friday, along with my co-host, James Yarcho, who's offered today's episode, and along with our everydayers who come through on a consistent basis, and we continue to appreciate your support of the show. Today's episode brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. On today's episode, we're diving into the Buccaneers 53-man roster to see where we went right, wrong, and what surprised us the most following our 53-man roster projections that we dropped earlier in the week before the Buccaneers released their initial 53-man roster. So starting with the official initial 53-man roster published by Tampa Bay Buccaneers senior writer and editor Scott Smith on Tuesday, here is what the Buccaneers initial 53-man roster looks like. You've got two quarterbacks on the roster. Here we've got Baker Mayfield and we've got Kyle Trask. On the running back group, we've got four of them. That's where kind of the first misconception on my part came in, because I only had three. Your four running backs: Rachaad White, the second-year back at Arizona State, Chase Edmonds, Keyshawn Vaughn, and Sean Tucker. In the wide receiver room, you've got five receivers: Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Raheem Jarrett, Trey Palmer, and Devin Tompkins. In the tight end room, you've got four tight ends: Cade Otton, O'Keefe, David Wells, and Payne Durham. Offensive linemen, you got Tristan Wirfs, Matt Filer, Robert Hainsey, Cody Mauch, Luke Gedeke, Nick Leverett, Justin School, Aaron Stinney, and Brandon Walton. Defensive linemen, Kalijah Cansey, Vita Vea, Logan Hall, Greg Gaines, Mike Green, and Will Golston. Outside linebackers are Shaq Barrett, Joe Tryon-Shoyinka, Yaya Diaby, Anthony Nelson, Cam Gill, and Marquise Watts. Inside linebacker, Levante David, Devin White, KJ Britt, Servassier Dennis. Your cornerbacks are Carlton Davis, Jamel Dean, Zion McCollum, D. Delaney, Josh Hayes, and Derrek Pitts. And your safeties are Antoine Winfield Jr., Ryan Neal, Christian Izien, and Kayvon Merriweather. Special teamers, you've got Jake Camarda, the punter, Chase McLaughlin, the kicker, and Zach Schreiner, the long snapper. So that is your initial 53-man roster for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Let's break this down just a little bit deeper. So you've got two quarterbacks on this roster: Baker Mayfield, Kyle Trask, despite the new emergency quarterback rule. So for those of you who are not fully up to speed on this new quarterback rule, basically the NFL this year, and yes, it's in response to what happened to the San Francisco 49ers in the NFC divisional round or championship round. Can't remember which round it was. Doesn't matter. The Kansas City Chiefs, San Francisco 49ers went through about 20 quarterbacks during the playoffs because they all kept getting injured. And a lot of people will say that that's the reason they didn't beat the Philadelphia Eagles and represent the NFC in the playoffs. Whether or not you believe it or not, it's going to depend mostly whether or not you're a Niners fan or an Eagles fan. For the rest of us, it doesn't really matter too much. But the NFL put a rule in place that says that teams can dress a third quarterback. So you can have two active quarterbacks on your game day active roster. So you have 53 men on your active roster. On game days, that 53 drops to 46. However, the NFL says you can have your 46 active roster or active game day roster, but you can have a 47th player dressed who is a third quarterback. He will not count on your 46, but he can still dress. If the need arises for you to have to pull in a third quarterback because your first two quarterbacks both go down to injury, you can put one of those injured quarterbacks off of the active 46, pull that third quarterback onto the active 46 so that you have a quarterback. So that's basically the gist of the emergency rule. The catch to that is that that third quarterback that you dress has to be on the active roster. He cannot be a practice squad player that you call up on game day. So we still have the rule where on game days, teams can pull up a practice squad player or two and make them active for that game. That quarterback cannot come from your practice squad. So basically, you have to have three quarterbacks on your roster in order to take advantage of this rule. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers decided thanks, but no thanks. we'll roll with 2 quarterbacks. They go with Baker Mayfield, Kyle Trask, and that's who they're going to take in the active roster. So no matter what happens with any quarterback on the practice squad, if they pull him up for game day, well, they're not going to, because then he'd have to be completely active. He can't be inactive on the game day inactive. So you would have 3 quarterbacks active on your game day 46, and that just doesn't make any sense. So the Buccaneers choosing not to, I would say follow that rule, but not to use the rule, right? So, and that's their prerogative to do so, of course. So the next observation on this roster: 4 running backs, 5 wide receivers, meaning, to me, I've got to believe that this means that this team is basically going to be relying on their running backs a whole heck of a lot, or you're going to see a lot of games where a receiver is called up from the practice squad to the active game day roster the day of, giving you 6 receivers, and one of these running backs is going to be inactive. It could be Chase Edmonds is banged up, so we'll just make him out for the game. He's not going to play, so he'll be one of our game day inactives. We'll call up David Moore, make him our 6th active receiver when we need him. Or, Sean Tucker gets banged up, or Rashad White gets banged up. Or if all of our backs are healthy, we'll pick the 3 that we want based on the matchups, based on the opponent, based on the recent performances. One of those guys will fall inactive, and then we'll activate a receiver. So one of those 2, you're either going to a whole lot of running backs, because, if you bring in 4 running backs and 5 receivers to an active game day roster on the active 46, you're using those running backs. You know what I mean? And none of these running backs really screams wide receiver to me. So I think you are definitely leaning on your running backs more. So I think it's more likely that you'll see one of these running backs inactive on game days, and then you'll see a wide receiver called up. But this way, they can protect their running backs, don't have to go through the waiver process, don't have to risk losing them. Just the way I see it. Again, there's no report on that. That's just how I see that might go down, right? The next observation: 9 offensive linemen, 12 total defensive front 7 players. So it's not 12 defensive linemen, right? But when you talk about the 3 down linemen, your defensive ends, your defensive tackle, and your 2 outside linebackers, and your inside linebackers, you're talking about your 12 defensive front players, your outside linebackers and inside linebackers, just your outside linebackers and your defensive linemen. Obviously, the 2 off-ball linebackers are part of that, but we're talking outside linebackers, defensive line, just in general. We got 12 of those guys, 9 linemen. I don't want to say typically, but I would say more often than not, you see teams kind of go 10-10, maybe 11-9, but 12-9 is a split you don't usually see. And we'll get into that here in just a little bit deeper. And then finally, you have 6 cornerbacks, despite the fact that Christian Izien is projected to be your starting slot defender, which is typically a position held by a cornerback. So if he's holding a slot position, you've got 2 starting corners, Jamel Dean, Carlton Davis, and then a starting safety who's playing in your slot, 2 starting safeties behind them. So you've got basically 4 backup cornerbacks, with, of course, D. Delaney having obviously the ability to play inside as well. I think Zion McCollum is mostly going to be relegated to an outside role this year. So I think that kind of explains a little bit of that. So that's just a little bit of a breakdown, but we're going to get into some surprises from this roster coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Bucs brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready for the NFL season with incredible offers from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and you'll get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Plus, all customers who bet $5 will get $100 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Now is the best time to join FanDuel. The app is easy to use, and you can be on everything from spreads to player props, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season with an offer you don't want to miss. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. Thanks again for making Locked On Bucs your first listen or your first view today and every day. Thanks again for coming through on a consistent basis like you do. You guys supporting the show allows James and I to do our dream for a living, and that is cover the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, at least for part of our living, if not our entire living. But it's because of you guys that we get to do this, so we greatly appreciate it, and we mean it. We say it every episode because we mean it, not because it's just something we say every episode. We genuinely mean it. So continue our look at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers 53-man active roster, initial 53-man roster, where we got it right, where we got it wrong, and where we got it surprised. So for this, every day, as you know, James and I both dropped our initial 53 mocks and projections. But for this episode, I'm only going to compare my 53-man projection because it's not really fair for me to sit here and say, oh, well, here's where James messed up and just, twist the knife into him when he's not here to defend himself. So we're going to look at mine, and we're going to look at where I went right and we're going to look at where I went wrong. So right off the bat, I was 3 for 3, right? Because Chase McLaughlin, Jake McCarta, what is wrong with me? Jake Camarda and Zach Triner are your specialists. So 3 for 3. So everybody, round of applause for me. 3 for 3 right off the bat. All right. Getting to the offense. All right. I got the quarterbacks right. 2 quarterbacks on this roster. That's what I projected. Running backs is where I went wrong, though, right? I kind of already mentioned that. But I had Rachaad White, Chase Edmonds, Sean Tucker. I did think that the Buccaneers were going to waive Keyshawn Vaughn, potentially bring him back to the practice squad, depending on what happened with waivers and his attitude and everything else. But the Buccaneers decided to go ahead, keep him on the active roster. So that was my first strike, if you want to call it that. If we're going by strikes, I'm going to strike out. I promise you that. Going to receivers, I had David Moore on my active roster. The Buccaneers decided to waive David Moore, allow him to go through the waiver process. He is now on the practice squad. Tight ends, I think we pretty much all, I think, had that one nailed, right? I think pretty much everybody knew 4 tight ends, K-Dot and Kokeith, David Wells, Payne Durham. So as much as I would love to pat myself on the back for that one, I don't think that's pat on the back worthy. So I had 10 offensive linemen. The Buccaneers went 9. The one that I had on the roster that the Buccaneers did not keep, John Molchon. So he's not on the active roster. So that's where I went wrong on my projection. Defensive line, specifically defensive tackles, defensive ends. I had 6 of them making the roster. 6 of them did make the roster, but I had Patrick O'Connor on the 53. The Buccaneers did not keep Patrick O'Connor on the 53. Instead, they kept Mike Green, who I think I had coming back on the practice squad. Outside linebackers, I was 2 off on the outside linebacker counts. Now, the ones that I projected on the active roster did make it, so partial credit, I guess. But Cam Gill, I had going to the practice squad, as I did Marquise Watts. They both end up on the active roster. Inside linebackers, I added J.J. Russell to my initial 53. The Buccaneers decided to waive him. So outside of Levante David, Devin White, K.J. Britt, Servasi Dennis, that's where I went wrong. Cornerbacks, I had them keeping Keenan Isaac and waiving Josh Hayes. I kind of knew it was a little bit of a bold prediction when I did it, and it turns out that it was wrong. Not only did they keep Josh Hayes, but they also kept Derrek Pitts as well. And that was a little bit of a surprise, I think, to really everybody. So Jamel Dean, Carlton Davis, third, Zion McCollum, D. Delaney, Josh Hayes, and Derrek Pitts are your cornerbacks. Safeties, I got correct except for Nolan Turner. Nolan Turner not on the roster. He was on my initial 53. So that's where I went wrong and where I went right compared to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers' actual initial 53. So let's get into our surprises. I've got 4 surprises that I picked out from the roster as it was revealed by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I'm going to give you 2 here. I'll give you 2 to end the episode, and that's how we'll wrap this up. If you've got surprises that I don't talk about, or if you have thoughts on my surprises, by all means, drop them in the YouTube comments. Hit me up on Twitter, email, or however you want to discuss this with me. So surprise number 1, it's got to be cornerback Derrek Pitts, right? I mean, I don't know that there's been a whole lot of buzz about him. Shout out to Pewter Report. They did do a story on him early in training camp about how well he was doing. So, shout out to those guys over there. I can't remember which one of their reporters actually wrote it, but shout out to Pewter Report just in general for, maybe being the first ones on the fact that Derrek Pitts was making a way for himself. So Derrek Pitts had quite a road to get to the National Football League. Started his collegiate career at West Virginia. Then he transferred to Marshall. Then he transferred to NC State. So it's a lot of traveling he did. And I'll tell you, not only shout out to Pewter Report for, maybe pegging this guy earlier than anybody else, but shout out to the Buccaneers scouting staff and general manager Jason Light and the entire crew that evaluates talent. Because not only did Derrek Pitts go to 3 different colleges, he also didn't go to the scouting combine. And that's really hard. Like, it's really hard to scout talent when you're just jumping from scheme to scheme to scheme. You know what I mean? You really got to kind of rely on the raw tools and project, do those raw tools match what we want to do as a defense and all those things. And then no scouting combine to measure up against. And then I assume he went to NC State's pro day, right? But the main article covering the NC State pro day by a local Carolina paper didn't even mention him on the pro day recap. Like, listed players that were at the pro day didn't mention Derrek Pitts. You know what I mean? So that's how, like, kind of on the peripheral Derrek really was through this draft process. So for the Buccaneers scouts and staff to really hone in on him, I think it's really impressive. So I think people deserve a round of applause. Again, it's only one player and all that stuff. So I'm not trying to sit here and say throw him a Super Bowl parade, but I think it's a cool thing when you see these kinds of things happen. So between the 3 schools in his collegiate career, Derrek racked up 348 tackles, 13 sacks, 35 tackles for losses. Seems to be much more of a tackling type of safety than he is a cover safety. He only had 2 interceptions. in his collegiate career, but he also had a returned field goal block, which I think is cool. According to PFF, he had a 51.3 overall defensive grade last season, but during his collegiate career, he had 3 years at 68.2 or higher, which puts him in the green category. One of those years came at NC State, one at Marshall, one at West Virginia. His highest graded defensive season came at West Virginia, 74.5 in that season. So Derrek Pitts, a pleasant surprise, right? I mean, you love finding gems like that. I think scouts and GMs, that's really where you hang your hat, is finding those late round picks, finding those UDFA gems like Raheem Jarrett, by the way, who deserves obviously some praise. And then Devin Tompkins, you know what I mean? Second year, but undrafted guy, right? So surprise one, Derrek Pitts, cornerback, makes the active roster. Congratulations to him. And good luck in the rest of his NFL career as well this season and beyond. So surprise number 2, 4 running backs, 5 wide receivers, including keeping Keyshawn Vaughn. That's got to be one of the surprises here of the active roster. Now, according to J.C. Allen, a Pete Report, he tweeted on Tuesday, Sean Tucker will be the team's number 2 back. Now, I have not reached out to JC about this. I probably should have. I could have. I didn't. But I'm not sure if JC was reporting that or if that was just a bold statement, right? Because JC didn't say like according to team source or according to source or according to someone. He just tweeted like Sean Tucker is going to be the number 2 back. So I'm not sure if that's a report really or if it's a bold statement. I looked up Scott Smith, senior writer and editor of Buccaneers.com. His roster announcement article said, quote, Tucker showed enough in camp to grab the last RB spot, unquote. So, but that doesn't necessarily mean like last in the depth chart either. It just, you know what I mean? So a little bit to be determined, I guess, on the Sean Tucker front. I know BucsGameDay.com ran with JC's report or tweet as a report, which, you know, I think is fine. It could be a report. I just don't have that clarification. But I think it's really weird to keep 5 receivers in a passing league like we have in today's NFL, right? And that's really where the surprise comes from. It's not so much 4 RBs as much as is 5 wide receivers, right? That to me is the bigger surprise. And like I said, if in season we look at this and, you know, a David Moore or whoever, a Kalen Geiger, whoever it is, gets called up from the practice squad and is made active to be a 6th receiver, and then one of these 4 running backs is deemed game day inactive, then it kind of all starts to make sense. You know what I mean? So still a little bit of TBD on there, but just looking at the surface of 4 running backs, 5 receivers in today's NFL is just a little bit weird to me. So those 2 things surprised me about the Buccaneers' initial 53-man roster, but I got 2 more things that were a little surprising. That's coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Bucs. I'm your host, David Harrison, on Twitter, DHarrison82. Appreciate you coming through and watching, hopefully enjoying the episode. 53-man roster reaction breakdown and surprises. Surprise number 3. All right, so surprise number 1, Derrek Pitts, pleasant surprise. Surprise number 2, 4 running backs, 5 wide receivers. Not a negative or a positive, just kind of curious, right? A little bit of a question mark. Surprise number 3, second surprise involving wide receivers here. So back-to-back receivers involved. Not only did the Tampa Bay Buccaneers choose to keep only 5 wide receivers on their initial 53-man roster, but 3 of them have a combined career snap total of 72. Of course, 2 of them are rookies, which is why you don't have any snaps. Devin Tompkins has 72 career snaps. 2 of the 5 players that they kept in the receiver room are undrafted free agents from the last 2 years, Devin Tompkins being one and Raheem Jarrett being the other. And it's just a little surprising. You know what I mean? A veteran like David Moore gets waived, ends up on the practice squad. Again, we talked about Fox Sports' Greg Auman commenting or tweeting about how it could be just, you know, creative bookkeeping. David Moore's veteran contract was set to go fully guaranteed. So doing it this way, basically he's only, you know, he's paid practice squad rates, but then he's only paid more when he's elevated and activated. And that kind of feeds into my theory that maybe the Buccaneers, the reason they kept 4 backs, 5 receivers is because they plan on activating David Moore. And now you've got 3 veteran wide receivers and 3 not rookies, all of them, but 1 rookie or 1 second-year player, 2 rookies in your wide receiver room. Just a lot of youth, right? You got a new quarterback, a new offense. Your number 2 running back is unproven at best, no matter who it is. Honestly, Chase Edmonds, you know, hasn't had the greatest run the last couple of years. Sean Tucker certainly is unproven, and Keyshawn Vaughn certainly is unproven, at least not proven to be consistently reliable. So just a lot of question marks there, just a lot of curiosities. Again, not a negative, you know what I mean? I'm not sitting here saying you should never have 2 or more second-year players or rookies in your receiver group. That's not the case. And I certainly, pounded the table for a guy like Trey Palmer, and Devin Tompkins is someone that we spoke very highly of last season and leading up to the preseason, and Raheem Jarrett, a local guy out from where I live. I live in the DMV, and he went to Maryland, so I'm certainly happy to be seeing him having success and on a team that I get to cover, because that makes it even more exciting for me. So, certainly not a dig by any means, just a little bit curious and a little curious to see how it pans out, because we saw the Green Bay Packers last year, right? They relied on a lot of young receivers, and it did not go well early on. And they were able to rebound and get better, obviously. But this Buccaneers squad, with the way that the NFC South is, the way that all, the entire NFC is, if they stumble because they're relying on some younger players that don't necessarily pick up in crucial times, it could become a problem. So we'll see how it turns out. But that was something that was a little bit of a surprise to me. Surprise number 4, 12 defensive front 7 players, 9 offensive linemen. Again, it's not unusual to see a 10-9 split, a 10-10 match, an 11-9 split, but that extra one, that 12-9, it just kind of stuck out a little bit to me, right? And special teams contributions from the outside linebacker position certainly contributing to that. James Yarcho pointed out in his 53-man projection, keeping more outside linebackers than I did, and because of the special teams contribution, along with, honestly, some of the uncertainty at the position. So, nobody wants to bring this up because they don't want to talk it into reality, and I certainly don't want to talk it into reality. But next year, if the Tampa Bay Buccaneers move on from Shaquille Barrett, they save $7 million in salary cap space. And Joe Tryon-Shoyinka, if he doesn't step up this year, they likely decline his 5th-year option. So you kind of have this sense that, depending on how the season goes for both these guys, I mean, if they both ball out, then you eat the $7 million, you keep them, you keep Shaq, and you pick up JTS. You probably pick up his 5th-year option and you roll forward, right? But if Shaq falters for one reason or another, whether it's health or performance, maybe you move on and you take that $7 million dead cap, or save that $7 million after the dead cap number. If JTS doesn't ball out, then maybe you decline that 5th-year option. I think they're more likely to do that if not. So I think that having all these outside linebackers, let's say there is an injury or there's a fault, you have the opportunity to rotate some of these guys in. And let's see if some of you have that outside linebacker of the future look that we're looking for this Buccaneers offense. And I think that that's essentially what you're doing. You're keeping so many outside linebackers, one, for the special teams contributions, but 2, for finding out if you are potentially that dude for the future that we can lean on. Because if you are, we may move on from one of these other guys. And I think the trickle down of that is you look at the inside linebacker position, you only have 4 of those guys. Inside linebackers contribute to special teams all the time too. And KJ Britt, Servassier Dennis, certainly expect them to. But I think when you look at the depth of off-ball linebackers and the depth of outside linebackers, I think this kind of paints a picture that one of the two, you're either releasing Shaq or you're not picking up JTS's 5th-year option, and you're probably franchise tagging Devin White if you can't come to an agreement on a contract. So that's a way far out there, kind of connecting the dot, right? Like I'm connecting a dot from the end of August to next May. You know what I mean? So that's a huge stretch, a huge stretch of connecting dots there by me. And I own that. I accept that. But that's just the way that I see it. So unless the outside linebacker position proves worthy of trust beyond 2023, I think this could be a season, an off season after this year that we see a little bit of transition happen within this group. And then you tag Devin White to keep him in place while you work through that transition. But again, I don't know how tagging Devin White is going to go if you actually do it. What I do know is that James Yarcho will be back for our next episode. That one is dropping Friday live, so make sure you come through that. We're picking up our Friday live episodes again like we did last season, so come up for that. I will not be there. One of my good buddies is having a birthday dinner during the time that James will be live, so unfortunately I will not be there. So this week, a little bit of hodgepodge, me solo, him solo, but we're getting you some episodes. We're talking about some Bucs stuff because we got some important stuff coming up, and then it's all leading into game week, baby. We got, after that live, our very next episode will be inside the first game week of the regular season. So that's coming up on our Friday episode, coming up next week. In the meantime, if you got questions or comments, leave them in the YouTube chat. Email them to lockedonbuckspodcast@gmail.com. Hit me on Twitter, dharrison82, or the show at Locked On Bucs. Thank you so much for making Locked On Bucs first listen or view today and every day. Every day is, again, greatly appreciate you coming through, supporting the show like you do. Till we speak again, please be safe, be kind, fire those stinking cannons. We'll see you next time for another episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.